These waiters know nothing, just servants. The words rolled casually off the billionaire CEO's tongue, coated with arrogance, thrown out like scraps to amuse the table of men who surrounded him. The young black waitress, standing at his side, pen and notepad in hand, seemed invisible to him. Some of his companions smirked. Others outright chuckled, their laughter spilling over the polished wood table. They weren't laughing at the menu or the wine list or the evening specials. They were laughing at her. Amara did not flinch. She had carried trays heavier than her own body weight, endured insults that cut deeper than this one, and still managed to smile through it all. But she heard every word. Her ears were sharp, her memory sharper, and her dignity sharper still. The CEO leaned back, adjusting his cufflinks as though the entire restaurant was his personal stage. He smirked again, and in the same foreign language, he added another remark, his tone dripping with mockery. The men burst out laughing louder, and Amara knew this was not accidental. He was doing it deliberately, using a language he assumed she couldn't understand, to degrade her openly without consequence. She finished writing down the wine order, her pen steady, her face unreadable. Then she straightened her posture, her voice even and calm. "Would you prefer cold water or room temperature, sir?" she asked, not in English, not in the language he expected, but in his own, perfectly, fluently. The table froze. The laughter collapsed instantly into silence. One of the men nearly dropped his fork. Another shifted uncomfortably, coughing into his napkin. Even the air seemed to thicken as all eyes turned toward her. The CEO's smile twitched, faltered for just a fraction of a second, before he forced it back into place. His pride would not allow him to show shock. Not here, not in front of his men. He chuckled dryly, waving his hand dismissively. "Cute trick," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. She probably memorized one sentence. Nothing more. Amara said nothing. She only turned smoothly to the man on his left, and in the same flawless fluency asked him for his entree. The man blinked, startled, struggling to compose himself. He responded quietly, his voice almost embarrassed, as though acknowledging her abilities somehow betrayed his boss. But Amara simply nodded, scribbled the order down, and moved gracefully around the table, taking each man's request in the language they thought was theirs alone. By the time she collected the last order, the table had sunk into awkward silence. The air around them felt different now, no longer filled with superiority, but with unease. When Amara walked away, heads turned to watch her, not because she was a waitress, but because she had turned the tables on a man who wasn't used to being challenged. The CEO's jaw tightened. His grip on his glass hardened, as though he could crush it into dust. His voice was lower now, edged with anger. "Coincidence," he muttered under his breath. "Just a trick." But inside, doubt began to crawl its way into his chest. Amara returned minutes later, balancing a tray of crystal water glasses. Her steps were measured, her back straight, her face calm. She could feel their eyes on her, their anticipation, their silent calculation of whether she would stumble. She didn't. She placed each glass carefully, then set the final one before the CEO. He smirked again, his pride demanding a new attempt at humiliation. He leaned forward, his words deliberate this time, sharp as blades meant to cut. "Maybe water is the only thing you can get right. After all, you're just a waitress. That's all you'll ever be." Gasps escaped from a couple of his companions, the boldness of the insult too raw even for them. The restaurant seemed to still. Amara straightened. Her dark eyes met his without fear, and in the same calm, flawless fluency that had silenced him before, she replied, "Language doesn't make a man valuable. Character does. Anyone can be wealthy, but not every wealthy man has respect." The words struck like lightning. The table was silent, each man frozen, their gazes darting between the waitress and their powerful host. One of them muttered under his breath, "She's right," before quickly falling quiet. The CEO's face reddened, his mask cracking. For the first time that night, his superiority was slipping. At the bar, two waiters exchanged whispers. "Did you hear that?" one said, eyes wide. She just shut him down in his own language. The bartender grinned. About time someone did. Word began to ripple across the restaurant. Guests leaned slightly toward the CEO's table, pretending to sip their wine, pretending to be engaged in their own conversations, but all listening. Staff peeked from corners, some biting back smiles, some holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The CEO wasn't finished. His pride demanded retaliation. He raised his voice, trying to reclaim authority. "We didn't come here for lectures. We came here for dinner." Amara didn't argue. She inclined her head slightly, collected her tray, and walked away, but the silence she left behind was deafening. Behind the counter, Amara paused to take a breath. She had not planned for this, but when arrogance crossed a line into open humiliation, something inside her refused to bow. She thought of her grandmother's voice, the woman who had insisted she learn languages when she was young. One day, her grandmother had told her, "These words will be your shield." And tonight, they were. She returned to the floor with poise, delivering appetizers with the same calm grace. But the CEO couldn't leave it alone. His pride was a wound, bleeding and raw, and he needed to prove himself again. As she placed the dish before him, he sneered. "If you're as clever as you pretend to be, explain something. How can a poor woman like you ever understand our world? A world built on power, on wealth, on intelligence you'll never have." The table leaned back. Some men looked uncomfortable, others eager for the showdown. Amara placed her tray firmly against her hip, and for a moment, she simply studied him. Then, in the same calm, deliberate tone, she answered, "Your world? The world doesn't belong to the rich. It belongs to everyone. You only believe money gives you the right to mock others. But money doesn't buy dignity, sir. It only exposes who is none." A collective breath seemed to leave the table at once. One guest whispered, "She's fearless." Another nodded faintly, his lips twitching with something dangerously close to admiration. The CEO's hands tightened on his glass. His jaw flexed. For the first time, his silence betrayed him. He had no quick retort, and that silence spoke louder than all the laughter he had begun with. What Richard didn't know was that this was only the beginning. Amara's knowledge, her strength, and her story ran deeper than he, or anyone in that room, could imagine. By the end of the night, it wouldn't just be his pride that was shattered. It would be his entire illusion of power. The words hung in the air like a blade, sharp and irreversible. Amara's calm voice, unshaken by the weight of the billionaire's arrogance, had pierced the noise of the evening and silenced everything around them. For the first time in his long career of dominance and control, Richard Almanzor sat speechless in public, his massive confidence cracking under the eyes of strangers. The restaurant, once buzzing with laughter, clinking silverware and the rhythm of a live piano, had stilled to an unnatural hush. Every guest, from the corner booths to the bar near the entrance, had shifted their attention to the scene at the center of the room. They were watching, waiting, almost holding their breath, as though the outcome of this confrontation meant something greater than just a spat between a customer and a waitress. Richard's eyes burned into her, searching for some sign of fear, some indication that his status, his wealth, his power still held meaning here. But Amara stood firm, tray balanced gracefully at her side, posture upright, her expression calm. It wasn't defiance he saw in her, not the kind of reckless challenge he was used to from men who thought themselves bold enough to oppose him. It was something else, something colder, something unshakable, dignity. His lips curled into a thin, mocking smile, though the tremor at the corner betrayed his anger. "Do you have any idea who you are speaking to?" he demanded, his voice rising, sharp enough to make the manager flinch 2 tables away. "Do you understand the gravity of this moment? I could buy this restaurant, fire you with a snap of my fingers, and have you blacklisted from every fine establishment in the city." A murmur rolled across the room. The audience, strangers who had walked in expecting only dinner and soft music, were now witnesses to a man's pride unraveling. Some exchanged uneasy glances. Others leaned forward, captivated, unable to look away. Amara blinked slowly, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of composure that Richard lacked. "I understand perfectly. But what I don't understand is why a man with all the power in the world feels the need to belittle someone serving his table. Is your seat at the head of the boardroom not enough, Mr. Almanzor? Must you also try to conquer the ones you consider beneath you?" The air tightened, a string pulled to its breaking point. Somewhere at the back, a man let out a quiet gasp. The pianist stopped entirely now, hands frozen above the keys. Richard's fingers clenched around the stem of his wine glass, so tightly it seemed it might snap. He leaned forward, voice low, a hiss that barely carried across the table. "You think you're clever, don't you? A few rehearsed lines, a lucky guess at my language, and suddenly you feel powerful? I've dealt with women like you before, proud, sharp-tongued, believing themselves untouchable. Let me tell you something. Everyone has a weakness, and I always find it." His words were meant to wound, to intimidate, but Amara's expression remained unchanged. If anything, her stillness was more unsettling than defiance. It made the onlookers shift in their seats, unsure of who truly held the upper hand. Then she smiled, faint and measured. Perhaps. But sometimes, Mr. Al-Mansour, the real weakness lies in believing that no one can surprise you. Her words landed like a stone in still water, rippling outward, reaching every corner of the restaurant. The guests were no longer passive observers. They were participants in the silent judgment forming around him. Whispers moved through the crowd like a current, subtle but unmistakable. Richard caught them. He heard the faint snickers, the quiet words, arrogant, embarrassing, she's right. His pride roared again, a beast clawing at his insides. He couldn't stand it. Not here, not in public, not in front of these strangers whose respect meant nothing. And yet everything. He slammed his glass onto the table with a force that sent a sharp crack echoing through the room. Red wine spilled, staining the white tablecloth like blood. "Manager," he barked, his voice thundering across the floor. "Douglas." The manager nearly stumbled as he rushed over, his face pale with dread. "Why, yes, sir. How can I assist?" Richard pointed a trembling finger at Amara. "This woman has insulted me in front of my colleagues. I want her gone. Fired. Right now. Do you hear me? Out of this building before I make one call and shut this entire establishment down." Douglas turned to Amara, his lips parting to speak, but the hesitation in his eyes betrayed him. He had seen everything. He had heard the insults that started this. He knew, deep down, that firing her in this moment would not only be unjust but catastrophic. The crowd was already watching too closely. "Sir, please," Douglas stammered, sweat beading his forehead. "Let's not escalate this. Perhaps we can." "Now!" Richard roared, slamming his fist against the table. Plates rattled. Guests jumped in their seats. Before Douglas could find the courage to answer, Amara stepped forward, her voice steady but louder this time, carrying across the room with deliberate clarity. "You want me fired for defending my dignity? For responding to words you thought no one would understand?" The audience stirred, leaning closer. Some even nodded in agreement. Richard's face twisted, realizing the room was no longer his ally. Amara turned slightly, addressing not just him but the guests around. "This is what happens when power goes unchecked. It tries to silence the voices it cannot control. But respect isn't bought with money, and dignity isn't taken with threats." A quiet cheer rose from the corner of the room, hesitant but real. A young woman clapped softly, then stopped, embarrassed by the attention. But the energy had shifted. The weight of the crowd was tilting, slowly but unmistakably, against Richard. His chest heaved, fury choking him. He wasn't used to this. In boardrooms, people bent under his gaze. In negotiations, silence followed his threats. But here, in this restaurant, he was losing ground to a waitress. No one will remember this moment. He spat finally, though his voice cracked slightly. "You're nothing, just a waitress. Tomorrow, I'll still be a billionaire and you'll still be this." He waved a dismissive hand at her uniform. Amara tilted her head, eyes steady. "Perhaps. But tomorrow, people here will remember more than your money. They'll remember your character. And so will I." The silence that followed was crushing. Richard felt it pressing against him, squeezing the air from his lungs. He looked around desperately, searching for support, but all he saw were eyes, disapproving, judgmental, unyielding. For the first time in years, he felt small. But Richard Al-Mansour was not a man who surrendered. No, if anything, this moment only hardened his resolve. His lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes narrowing with the kind of cold calculation that had built his empire. He leaned back in his chair, forcing composure, and let out a laugh that rang false in the heavy air. "Very well," he said finally, voice dripping with ice. "Enjoy your little victory tonight. But don't think this is over. I always collect my debts." Amara didn't respond. She simply bowed her head slightly, a gesture of calm respect, and turned to walk away. But in her chest, her heart pounded. She knew men like him. Men who didn't forget humiliation. This was not the end. As she disappeared into the kitchen, the restaurant slowly came back to life, though the energy was altered forever. Conversations buzzed with whispers of what they had just seen. Guests replayed the words, the defiance, the arrogance undone by dignity, at his table. Richard sat rigid, his hand tightening around the stem of another glass. His colleagues shifted uncomfortably, some avoiding his gaze, others stealing glances toward the door where Amara had gone. They had witnessed something they would not soon forget. And in Richard's mind, a storm brewed. Plans, schemes, calculations. He would not let this go. He could not. His pride demanded retribution. Somewhere in the back, Amara leaned against the counter. Taking a deep breath, she had stood her ground. She had spoken truth to power. But she also knew, deep inside, that this was only the beginning of something larger, something she could not yet see. The night was not over, and neither was the war between them. The night air outside the restaurant was cool, brushing against Richard Almansor's flushed cheeks as he stormed out, his entourage trailing behind like nervous shadows. He yanked at his tie, muttering curses in Arabic under his breath, his polished shoes striking the pavement with angry precision. How dare she? A waitress, a nobody, a black woman who should have bowed her head and taken his words like all the others. Instead, she had not only understood him, but responded with sharpness that cut deeper than he expected. Inside the restaurant, Amara exhaled slowly. Her hands were steady, but her chest carried the weight of what had just happened. She knew men like Richard, men who saw humility as weakness, who believed money could crush any resistance. She had stood her ground tonight, but she also knew the story wasn't over. By morning, the ripple had already spread. A few diners had whispered about the scene, and someone had even captured fragments of the exchange on their phone. A shaky clip began circulating online, Amara's calm voice replying fluently in Arabic while the billionaire CEO sat frozen in his seat. The caption read, "Waitress silences arrogant billionaire in his own language." Within hours, the clip gained traction. Comments flooded in. That man thought money makes him untouchable. Respect the sister. Fluency is power. Never underestimate the people you think are beneath you. Who is she? She's incredible. Richard, however, wasn't amused. At his penthouse suite, he hurled his phone across the room as the video reached 100,000 views. His PR advisor tried to calm him, but he refused to listen. "No waitress humiliates me in public," he growled. "I'll end her career. I'll buy that restaurant. I'll crush her." Back at the restaurant, Amara returned for her shift. Some of her co-workers looked at her differently now, with awe, with quiet respect. A few whispered encouragements as she passed, but others feared for her. The manager, Douglas, called her into his office. His eyes darted nervously. "Amara, I don't know what to say. The owner called me this morning. Richard Almansor has been in contact. He's pushing hard." Amara sat down calmly. "Pushing for what?" "For your termination," Douglas admitted, his voice low. "He threatened to buy out the restaurant chain if we don't let you go. He says you embarrassed him publicly." Amara folded her hands in her lap. Her voice carried no tremor. "And what did the owner say?" Douglas hesitated. "The owner's considering it. You know how much money talks." For a brief second, the weight pressed on her. She needed this job, not for pride, not for luxury, but to support her younger sister's college tuition. But fear wasn't new to her. She had been underestimated her whole life. She stood slowly. "Douglas, do you know why I speak Arabic?" He shook his head. "Because I studied diplomacy before life pulled me into hospitality," she said softly. "I was raised to believe language was a bridge, not a weapon. Men like Richard forgot that." Douglas blinked, taken aback. "And if the owner fires me," Amara added, her eyes steady, "let it be clear, they're choosing the side of a bully, not a justice." That evening, the restaurant was busier than ever, not because of reservations, but because word had spread. People wanted to see her, to see the waitress who stood up to a billionaire. Reporters lingered near the entrance. Customers whispered her name as she walked past their tables. For the first time, she wasn't invisible in her uniform. She was unforgettable. And then, as though scripted, Richard returned. He walked in flanked by two men in suits, his face cold, his gaze scanning until it landed on her. The room quieted. "Fire her," he demanded of Douglas, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Now." All eyes turned. Cameras tilted. This wasn't just a restaurant scene anymore. This was theater. Douglas swallowed hard, glancing at Amara. His voice wavered. "Mr. Almansor, the board will decide. We can't." Richard slammed his hand on the counter. "I own this city. No one embarrasses me and walks away with a job." The crowd murmured disapproving. Someone shouted from the back, "Money doesn't buy respect." Richard turned red, spinning toward the voice, but before he could speak, Amara stepped forward. Her voice was calm, yet it carried across the restaurant. "You keep asking people if they know who you are, but tonight, maybe you should ask yourself who you become." The silence was electric. She switched effortlessly into Arabic, her words precise, sharp. A strong man doesn't need to humiliate others to prove himself. Gasps echoed again. Cameras recorded every second. Richard opened his mouth, but for the first time in years, no words came. He was trapped, outnumbered, and most of all, exposed. By the next morning, the full video of the confrontation had gone viral. Millions watched. Headlines spread. Waitress humiliates billionaire in fluent Arabic. The power of dignity versus the arrogance of wealth. Richard's stock prices dipped as public outrage spilled over into his businesses. Sponsors pulled out of deals. His PR team scrambled, but every attempt to spin the narrative backfired. Meanwhile, Amara received offers, universities inviting her to lecture on cross-cultural communication, organizations asking her to represent them. The restaurant owner, seeing the tidal wave of support, announced publicly, "We stand with Amara." And that night, as Amara walked home beneath the quiet city lights, her phone buzzed with messages of encouragement from strangers across the globe. She paused, smiling softly to herself. Richard had tried to silence her, to reduce her to nothing. Instead, he had amplified her voice to the world. Karma had spoken, and dignity had won. If you enjoyed this story, remember, arrogance always meets its match. Dignity and respect always shine through. Don't forget to like, share, and comment your thoughts below. And for more powerful stories like this, subscribe to Residential Stories.